Well, hello, Governor. Why don't you step in for a pot of tea with your old pal, King Waspinator? And welcome back to Total Party Skills. Be sure to hit like and subscribe. I'd been considering taking some notes, doing a little reading, to do some videos perhaps about the Hollow World. It's like a very classic and somewhat like overlooked D&D setting of old. And in doing so, it kind of stirred up a couple of thoughts on a few things. Kind of just about how AD&D and Basic kind of relate to each other. Because, well, like digging down through it a bit more specifically than I have in quite a while, it kind of just like made me notice like a lot of the things that kind of made a Basic D&D distinguishable and different from AD&D, and that maybe in some way Basic D&D might actually be the better game. Its presentation is simpler, at least in terms of like player character offerings. It does not give you the axis of choice of race and class. In some ways, the inclusion of the idea of race, in some ways, as a player, factor, is kind of an invention of the AD&D game. Since in Basic D&D, it's you're either if you're playing a human of one of the various human classes, or you're a demi-human. It's not really framed using the same terminology, and so in its subtle way, it just skips past some of the baggage that comes along by having called your options between humans and elves and dwarves and so on as being your character's race, because regardless of how it's used in fiction or was intended for use by the people who are writing it, the people encountering it are going to have in their heads their own definition of race. And so they're going to read that in a certain way. Much the same with class, although D&D has always kind of softballed the class. But in some ways, by just sticking to the 4 core basic classes, and that they're only really available as options for human players, you've both found a rather much more subtle way to encourage people to play human characters, because it gives them a better chance to play the specific kind of character type that they want, as opposed to just kind of having to like, well, a dwarf is mostly a fighter, or an elf can do magic, kind of a thing. So it gives them a carrot and reason to choose human when you have these superhuman options that live forever and all that kind of stuff. And also it does kind of in a subtle way replicate the classic human class system. Your fighters and magic users basically represent your nobility and warrior class. Post Bronze Age, most leadership is kind of emerges from or is directly in control of the military assets of whatever given kingdom or city-state or country, that the rulers are in control of. And so, fighters really are on a trajectory to become ruler-type characters. And in fact, in the older versions of D&D like this, there's reason why they, around level 10 or whatever it's set at, will suddenly start to like have the right to claim some land and build a stronghold and stuff. Even if they're not called knights, they become knights over time. And magicians, magic users too, you can kind of maybe say they're representing maybe kind of a bit more of a specialized, scholarly kind of a class, side class, also attached to like your noble ranks upper tier of society, because it takes a lot of money to finance getting a magical education and having all the various ingredients and implements one needs in order to be able to actually pull off a lot of these spells if you were being really hardcore about component rules and all that kind of stuff. Your clerics obviously represent your religious caste, and the thief class is really there to stand in for the peasantry. There's no point in playing a farmer or a blacksmith, at least, for the most optimally fun, the most adventurous type of poor peasant person is someone who's saying, fuck all this, I'm just gonna jack what I want and quit digging a mud hole for a living, kind of folks. And so, that your 4 classes are kind of actually reflecting the strata of human society. Magic users are people born to the upper class, whereas fighters are people who are socially mobile and moving up towards the noble class. Clerics are your middle tier religious class that has influence over, both pieces of bread and the sandwich it's stuck in. And if anything, they're probably most opposed to the magicians because they both in some ways come closest to replicating each other's social function and abilities. And then, the thieves stand in for the poor common man at the bottom. So you have that. There's been a lot of talk lately. There's been chatter, so to say, about this notion of people need to be encouraged to play humans because they do a poor job of playing elves, right? Kind of a thing. If you're going to be playing a non-human, you need to play it more alien than what you're doing if you're just basically just being yourself and just dressing your character up as if they're one of these races, mostly because you're trying to min-max something, or you're just the power set that comes with being a dragonborn, and you don't care about trying to portray the dragonborn as being dragonbornish. You're giving them a class that seems unlikely and all that kind of stuff. Well, by bringing class up, and part of that problem is kind of caused by the fact that D&D has evolved into this thing where it's any race, any class. At least in the earlier editions of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, that when they began this thing of you can choose different classes depending on your race, is they would still limit some of the options, dwarves not being allowed to be magic users and all that, but over time that's crept into pretty much an anything plus anything, which leads to you don't really, you have to revise everything if you want to use the older established settings in any way, so that you can create a world where gnomes can be paladins, or that you would have a dragonborn druid or ranger. You have to their culture has to be modeled in such a way that all these various occupations make sense. Why would you have a high elf barbarian or a tiefling barbarian? You have to account for that in your world to explain how someone like that can emerge from it. Otherwise, they're just characters can come from all sorts of various backgrounds and combinations. Your character group should be greatly varied and have a wide spread of powers and abilities, so they can handle any kind of task, and everyone has their moment to stand in the sunshine, and it's not too redundant. And all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, they still have to fit as characters in whatever the TV show concept of what your campaign is, so to say. You're trying to run something that's effectively like a Legend of the Seeker kind of game, or something Lord of the Rings light. Having an alien robot with a jetpack and laser vision as one of your player characters would kind of fuck all that up. So that's an extreme example, but that's that's basically what I mean. The characters do need to fit into the setting they're in, and if you're allowing your players to make all sorts of weird combination options, then they have to feel like they can have emerged from that setting. If all the wood elves live out in the fucking forest and live in camps and roam around nomadically, then they should basically only be allowed to choose barbarian, ranger, or wizard, or druid, and that should be about it. They shouldn't be allowed to pick anything. Halflings and gnomes, would they have any place in their culture where they would have had to developed a need for heavy combat type characters and all that kind of stuff? Lizard folk, all that kind of stuff. Basic D&D clears a lot of that up just because it just simplifies it. And yes, you can complain that you don't get to play quite as wide a variety of character concepts that you might have in your head for an elf. if you want to choose to play a basic Dungeons and Dragons elf. However, from the other end, if you're wanting people to, like, be their core essential version of what this non-human thing is supposed to be, then just give them the core essential version of that thing instead of giving them like 100 different variations by the time it's all said and done. Especially with modern day 5th edition type character design. But even going back to the older days, like as soon as they introduced the cross axis, it kind of created a wrinkle of complication for the non-humans, and also they labeled it race. That was just not necessarily an issue. You're choosing your class, basically, and just elf, halfling, or dwarf was a class. You're still a person, it wasn't, I don't know, that's just the whole thing just was framed a bit differently. But anyway, Hollow World. It's a very interesting high concept setting. It's kind of like the concept of a Star Trek episode almost, except you're playing in it and you're not just visiting it briefly and moving on, or unless you can contrive like a campaign to do that. There's a lot of stuff built into it where it's like, I almost would suspect that as soon as they started mapping it out, someone came into the room and was like, yeah, you realize that our magic system will allow like higher level player characters to completely fuck all this up. And so then they had to go back through and kind of write in a bunch of contrivances that basically like negate a large section of like available magic spells. You're not allowed to teleport or planar type magic. You can't, summon things. It affects like just a wide range of stuff that gives like in various kind of area effects and the ability to alter matter and just all that kind of stuff. So like it's a big turnoff for playing magic users in particular in the setting. Also, like it demands even higher ability score requirements to be able to qualify for magic users. Also, there's something about the magic that was worked into the setting to stop history from moving forward effectively. You have all these. The thing that makes it like a Star Trek episode is like the inner walls of the crust of the world of Mystara have been like terraformed by some immortals, led by the very first immortal, who apparently was a Tyrannosaurus Rex who achieved sentience and then eventually immortality, whatever, back in the age of dinosaurs. And after other immortals started to appear, they got together and they created the Hollow World to preserve peoples who had emerged on the world of Mystara, thousands of years later, to try to like protect them. Stuff tied in with all the things with the back history of Blackmore and the explosion of a starship and all that other kind of stuff being involved in it too. But anyway, like the star at the center is actually like an energy portal into like the elemental plane of pure energy or some kind of shit like that. And the continents and oceans are all like artificially created by the immortals using the various spheres of immortality, and that's where he starts to get into the fact of why Basic is actually kind of like radically incompatible with AD&D, and a good chunk of why Mystara has never really been properly translated. I know there was an attempt to do it with second edition, but it didn't seem to take off because they only ever put out a Karamikos and a Glantry book, and then they didn't, continue on with it. But like, there's been like little to nothing done except for stuff made by the fan community in the years since for third edition and onward to do Mystara, and that's because its cosmology like does not at all match up with the cosmology of AD&D and all of the other AD&D settings. It's very wed to its Mystara setting. Like all of its products are keyed off that. You can treat it as just a generic format for character creation and monsters and make your own world. And make that world's cosmology fit better, but like the very nature of like how character level advancement works when you get up to like the ridiculously high tier stuff in this game, the fact that your characters become immortals, which effectively makes them the gods of the setting, like that breaks the nature of what the gods are. Like all the gods become people who were once people, and they've all just achieved immortality, and now they've just been alive and kind of super powerful and a little crazy. for thousands of years, drunk on their own power and benevolence and all that kind of stuff. They're not like super entities from beyond reality like they are in AD&D Cosmology with Planescape and the Wheel of Cosmos, and like its portrayal of what the other planes are is different. There's echoes of similarity and occasionally a similar name for things, but they're not the same. Mystara does not exist in the same multiverse. It does not have a phlogiston. It's not floating out there alongside Forgotten Realms and Dark Sun and all the old ones, Eberron. Like this is a completely different continuum of reality in terms of how its cosmology works. And without that cosmology, you'd have to just completely reconceptualize Hollow World from the ground up. Because like the whole backstory of the immortal Tyrannosaurus Rex god, creating a portal to the plane domain of energy, to create a hollow, like it just doesn't work. The idea that you have all these little preserved ancient civilizations, though, like I said, that's a little Star Trek-y. We're gonna make sure, especially since some of them are an ancient Aztec kind of people, an ancient Oltec kind of people, ancient European barbarians, ancient Vikings, ancient pirates, ancient Greeks, ancient Egyptians, ancient Africans, ancient steppe nomads. I'm not really sure if any of them are really beyond the Mongolian style Genites. I'm not really sure if there's anything that's really a good analog for Han, China, or Japan. But if they have all just ridiculous amount of stuff already on the surface of Mystara, that's kind of part of my problem with Basic's standard setting using the known world of Mystara, is that it's very comparable to Forgotten Realms in that it's very lore heavy. And also is just kind of a lot of these cultures are real obvious on the nose riffs of various human cultures from the past and present from time to time. And so that kind of, I don't know. I like something with a setting that's a bit more cohesive and alien overall, and it's not necessarily just this is clearly France circa 1266 or whatever. Or this is obviously an analogy about the island of Corsica. Like I said, Mystara is possibly worse than Forgotten Realms about being a bit on the nose about that stuff, and it's got a lot of history that's very integrated across the setting. But you know what? Because they treat the non-humans the way they do, they're more kind of off in their own little kind of corners of the world. They're not on equal footing with humanity when it comes to global. Population spread or anything like that. They're all kind of relics of an older age. Humans are kind of on the rise and kind of everywhere now. And because the way the character creation also gives this broader variety of humans, whereas elf, dwarf, halfling, that's it. When it comes to as the DM, you're making the setting, well, you only have one default yourself to represent these things, where you have all these other kind of options for how to do human NPCs. So that kind of softball encourages the DM to have a more human focused setting, and so it makes sense that Mystara is like it is. And in a weird way, it is lore dense, and you can say it is maybe a bit too on the nose with the historical analogies, but at the same time, it also has a much broader presentation of human cultures than you see in damn near any other AD&D product to be thought of. Forgotten Realms possibly comes the closest, but even it falls a bit short, especially the way they so firmly have separated their Karator and Al-Qadim settings to be so completely removed from the core Western Europe, North American kind of commingled thing that you got going on in Faerun and around the Sea of Stars. Mystara gives you all sorts of different flavors of humankind and different kinds of human societies, and aside from the big ocean empires, on the main continent, like none of the big human nations are necessarily like more predominant than the others. One of their big core settings, Glantry in particular, even within its own borders, has several very distinct different kinds of human cultures going on within it because they're the way their nobles system is structured and all that kind of stuff. And you have a much broader variety of different kinds of governments and peoples and places. Like I said, it's kind of like a two-edged sword. You can kind of think maybe it's a bit of a cop-out that like every last place on Mystara is peopled by someone who's like, oh, that's suspiciously reminds me an awful lot about this one specific group of people back on Earth. But on the other hand, though, it also acknowledges them and incorporates them into the setting better than, let's say, a lot of your kind of more flat or generic AD&D settings. I also, like, rules-wise, there's some, like, minor differences here and there. In some ways, like, modern 5th edition D&D does pull features from this. Like, it does universal ability score bonuses that are just kind of flatly the same across all ability scores, as opposed to AD&D, where each one's got its own different chart and set of abilities and all that kind of stuff that key off of having an ability score of a various number and all that kind of stuff. Like in terms, its skill and proficiency system is pretty much the same as it is in AD&D. It does do something different with weapon mastery. I just tend to just ignore that. And just kind of treat it as like you go by your basic class list of what you're allowed to use, and we'll just worry about your non-weapon skills. Kind of a philosophy towards it. It does use THAC0. It is a bit more unclear about THAC0. You have to like look up a chart. You can always just do the old thing of subtract whatever it says the THAC0 AC is from 20, and then that way you get what the modern day ascending AC value would be. And that's all you really got to do to convert any of these old materials to the modern ascending AC. Subtract the AC from 20. Optionally 19 if you want to make it a little bit easier on the players. I've seen both be used by different people, but 20 I'd say is like the more fair hardcore mode version of it. Also, look, kind of in a weird way, like how they do their ability scores staggered out in a different order, so it's not all physical, mental. It's strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution, charisma, I think is their ordering. Which if you're rolling one by one, it does kind of lead to being spread out more what kind of like distribution of talents that your character has, because sometimes people like will roll really well early on and then kind of peter out with their rolls towards the end, or vice versa, and then that causes you to like, well, some person's really good at all their mental stuff, but they suck physically, or vice versa. This kind of gives you a bit more of a chance for a range, I find, when just goofing off and making characters for the make of making NPCs and stuff, just to entertain myself. Otherwise, it's still in many ways the D&D it is like a treasury reward system. Like I said, the leveling kind of at higher levels is where it kind of starts to fall off the rails, but like, if you can get there, you're already like off the rails for a variety of other reasons by that point. If you've been gaming and running a campaign that long that you're able to start becoming like gods and affect like global, geographic affairs and all that kind of shit. Like, I think by definition of course that's broken. Duh. Like, how is that not going to be broken? And hard to write for unless you've actually been the one running the game for these specific characters this whole time and all that kind of stuff. I feel that's kind of part of the problem with a lot of the higher level tier stuff in a lot of these games that let you level beyond 10th level and such, is that, past a certain point, if your character has gone to that level, you've been involved in that one campaign with a whole bunch of chain of events, and that character's got all sorts of weird personal interests and motivations going on. So, like, writing a pre-published adventure for characters like that when you don't know what they're going to be you know, and they don't know how on earth like the DM's going to have to be able to like warp the materials in this to get them on board with doing this adventure. Unless you've done some Dragonlance thing where you've like just every last single step of the way has already been written out in a published module. You know, like, yeah, I can understand why we don't get a lot of upper tier adventure mods from 5th edition, because, yeah, that's a lot harder to write for in advance. You know, even my own Common Core, you know, game master advice in terms of writing, it comes down to, like, focus the most on the start of your campaign and worry less about how you want to end it off, because things are going, as soon as it's in play, it's going to start doing all sorts of weird stuff that you weren't necessarily expecting. And so don't go in expecting anything else but that. And like I said, just give it a good beginning and pepper the setting with a lot of stuff that they can bump into, and hopefully like learn about plots that you want them to learn about organically, instead of you just like force feeding it to them through exposition. Anyway, I guess that's about that. Dungeons and Dragons Basic, is it better than Advanced Dungeons and Dragons or Modern Dungeons and Dragons? I mean, like, that's an unanswerable question. That's, like, I guess, a matter of personal tastes. I don't think it's not a ridiculous question to be asked, though. Depends on what you're looking for. You know, do players need more than like 8 or 9 different options of things to play? I mean, unless you've got a ridiculous amount of people playing, like that should be enough so that everyone can play something a little different from each other. So does everything need to be one of, you know, up to, what is it now, 10 races just in the core book, plus a factor of 12? Then you add in like all the other, like, there's just like how many combinations of stuff do you really need? How far does it go to until it becomes alien? Like, I saw some clips of the new Netflix Vox Machina cartoon, and like, I mean, it's like, I guess it's cool that they're giving a Goliath character some notice, but at the same time, it's like, what is this? Like, it doesn't even like seem like D&D anymore. Like, it just kind of looked like some weird mishmash of different animes. So you have a character from Full Metal Alchemist hanging out with a character from Goblin Slayer, and hanging out with some dude from some weird sci-fi thing about rock people. Like, it's just meaning like in How the Goliath guy, like all with this kind of like Avatar Last Airbender kind of anime style. Like, I guess that's where we're gonna go. I don't know. Like, is that like really showing people D&D? Like, what does D&D become? Like, if you're like wanting that old D&D flavor, like this kind of has to be it. Even the OSR games kind of incorporate, or at least a good chunk of them, the ones I've seen, incorporate that whole like, choose a race, choose a class kind of dynamic. Like DCC doesn't, and I'm sure there's a few others that don't. But you know, like if you're only like have like, let's be realistic, like, you know, like what is your average at-home tabletop play group? Like, let's ignore like playing online. I still kind of feel like that's a bit of a kind of a mental masturbation, and somewhat defeating the whole point of wanting to play role-playing games, is to hang out with people. If you're online, you can just play a video game and have a lot less drama and controversy. But, you know, fine. There should be more than enough options. Like the whole point of playing D is to play a warrior, a thief, a wizard, a halfling, or an elf, or a dwarf. Like, why does it like need all this second layer of shit where you can be a halfling ranger and a human warlock and an elf paladin and a dwarf wizard, and it's like, and a lizard-born half-dragon, half Aasimar with Sonic the Hedgehog powers. Like, yeah, that's D&D, guys. That's like, why are you playing this? Like, play a different game. You want to play an animal? Play After the Bomb by Palladium. That gives you can make all sorts of different animal characters, and it's setting appropriate. Oh well, I guess this is me being an old man yelling at the clouds for too long. Get the fuck out of here and stay waspinated.